All right, as the dawn comes up behind me here in York Springs, Pennsylvania, I thought I would read in a little section of my book, Entanglements, A System of Philosophy, about a hyper-obscure, radically interesting figure named Walking Stewart. One thing I like about my book, I being the only person who's ever read it really, is the digressions. So this is in the ontology chapter, and it's meant to be amusing, an amusing break that also helps to elucidate the ontology of the system. But Walking Stewart was a late 18th, early 19th century philosopher, or walker, who lived in London but walked the known world, and was friends or was a figure for the great romantics. He was about 20 years older than Wordsworth, so he was older than all the romantics, the British romantics, but a kind of paradigmatic figure in a certain way, as well as a figure of fascination and a figure of fun. All right. The life of the materialist philosopher Walking Stewart, author of 30 unreadable books and friend of great poets, is a crystallization of his ontology and of mine. John Stewart the Traveller was born on Bond Street in London in 1749. His father was a linen draper from Scotland. After getting kicked out of a variety of schools, young John was sent to Madras as secretary of the East India Company at age 15. He accompanied the warlike company expedition into a warlike company expedition into Tibet and Bhutan, which he portrays in a letter to the Royal Society in 1777 as one of the few Western contacts with these places and cultures since Marco Polo. Disgusted by the entire system of colonialism, particularly as expressed in the East India Company itself, beginning with the fact that the British stationed in India did not speak the local languages, he drafted a letter of protest addressed to the Court of Directors concerning the treatment of the indigenous population. His second letter of protest to the directors a year later, that is from 1765, from its juvenile insolence and audacity, is preserved on their records to this day. Who did I quote that from? Anyway, then, here's a quote. Get my book for all the footnotes, I guess. Maybe I'll try to do something in the comments or the description. From accounts written within a year or so of Stewart's death, this is a quote. It appears that on leaving the company's service, he struck into the interior of India with the purpose of learning the native dialects. According to the Gentleman's Magazine, he, quote, prosecuted his route over Hindustan and walked to Delhi. He, quote, he traversed the greater part of the Indian peninsula. Bronson's note. I guess all the documentation needs notes. Apparently, though the fact has not been noted, he got as far east as the Malay Peninsula. Wandering of this sort must have consumed at least a couple of years, during which he acquired considerable proficiency in the tongues. In an evil hour, his adventurous disposition drew him to Seringapatam, the capital of the warlike and treacherous Hyder Ali. As the dawn breaks behind me. Possibly Hyder Ali, 1720 to 1782, was regarded as warlike and treacherous because he was in the habit of launching rockets at the British, an innovative yet profoundly irritating anti-colonial strategy. So Stewart's service to Hyder Ali itself has the scent of treason. Indeed, a relative who wrote an essay about Stewart describes Stewart as a general in the Dalwai of Mysore's army, that's Hyder Ali, where others merely describe him as an interpreter. At any rate, a direct explanation of this interlude would be that Stewart was so disgusted by the behavior of the East India Company that he joined up with the other side. He was shot in Hyder Ali's service, and his relative Everard Brand reports in general that his body bore the marks of several desperate wounds by sword and bullet, and the crown of his head was indented nearly an inch in depth by a blow from some warlike instrument. Stewart escaped assassination by the Dalwise men by swimming a river. Brand then places him in the service of the Nabob of Arcot in south-central India as prime minister. He was greeted here and there as a heretic, though it is not clear whether, as a young man striding around Asia, he had already developed his frankly atheistic materialism. Here's again a quote from a relative. While Stewart was crossing the Persian Gulf, in a vessel manned exclusively by Mohammedans, a violent storm arose, which misfortune the crew attributed to their having a Gior on board. Brand makes it infidel. A council was held, and it was determined that the new Jonah should be cast overboard. It was with much difficulty that Mr. Stewart persuaded them to modify their resolution. It was at length settled that he should be immured in a hen coop and suspended from the main yard until the storm abated. In this elevated station he remained for some hours, nor was he released until the storm had entirely abated. That's one version of the story. Stories gathered around Walking Stewart. Another source has him hanging from the mast in the chicken coop for 2 weeks, during which he was, quote, arranging the opinions he had formed of mankind. That's pretty unusual way to form philosophy, suspended from the main mast in a chicken coop. From the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, he walked through Ethiopia and Abyssinia, where he saw naked people. Thence he crossed the desert of Arabia and arrived in Marseille, walked more or less the entirety of France, crossed the Pyrenees, tramped through Spain and Portugal. These are all have slices of quotes. Took ship for England around 1784. After alighting briefly in London, he trudged Sweden, Lapland, and Russia, but reported that he found no means to penetrate into China. In the autumn, possibly of 1786, Michael Kelly, the operatic tenor and friend of Mozart, ran across him in Vienna. Stewart had just arrived on foot from Calais, having passed through Italy and the Tyrol, and was on his way to Constantinople. In 1792, he was, among other places, in Paris during the September massacres, where he turned against political radicalism and befriended Wordsworth and Thomas Paine. According to Thomas de Quincey, Wordsworth thought that Stewart was, quote, the most eloquent man he'd ever heard discourse on Wordsworth's favorite subject, nature. Kelly Grovier argues plausibly that Stewart is the model for the phantom drifter who haunts the apocalyptic beginning of Book 5 of the Prelude. Always perfectly balancing the sublime and the ridiculous, Stewart was also the subject in the same 1792 of an operatic farce by William Pierce entitled Hartford Bridge or the Skirts of a Camp, where he was portrayed by the great comic actor Joseph Munden. He took 2 extended tours of the United States in the 1790s. A newspaper in Albany printed the following notice. On Thursday last, arriving in this city from London via New York, and the same evening setting off for Canada, Mr. Stewart, the noted pedestrian. Though he was chronically broke all over the world, the Jacobins, just confiscated with little cash, a word you've always read but never spoken, maybe, rarely. Jacobins confiscated with little cash he built up in South Asia while he was in Paris, for which he never forgave them. It turned him right. He was particularly so in North America, particularly broke in North America, where he was reduced to begging for food between lectures, but managed to publish the epic Lucretian poem, The Revelation of Nature, in New York in 1796. De Quincey has him bestriding the continent, the solitary forests of Canada, the swarming life of the torrid zone, the great deserts. After the turn of the century, he seems to have wandered mostly in the British Isles and was seen in Devonshire. He crossed to Ireland and walked from London to Edinburgh to consult Dugald Stewart, no relation. Now his reputation for sheer omnipresence, or for multiple simultaneous manifestations, narrowed to London, but was all the more striking for being localized. In 1822, a correspondent for the London magazine observed that everyone had seen walking Stewart sitting on a bench on the Westminster Bridge as though he'd never not been there. But then again, there he was in Hyde Park, with as perfectly an eternal air. But there he was shuffling along the Strand and Charing Cross and Cockspur Street. Where really was he? Asked our reporter. De Quincey quotes this passage, then writes, "In 1812, I think it was, that I saw him for the last time. And by the way, on the day of my parting with him, had an amusing proof in my own experience of that sort of ubiquity ascribed to him by the witty writer of the London magazine that we've just read. I met him and shook hands with him under Somerset House, telling him that I should leave town that evening for Westmoreland. Thence I went by the very shortest road, i.e. through Moore Street, Soho, for I am learned in many quarters of London, toward a point which necessarily led me toward the Tottenham Court Road. I stopped nowhere and walked fast. Yet so it was that in the Tottenham Court Road I was not overtaken by, that was comprehensible, but overtook walking Stewart." That is, there's the vague suggestion that the traveler possessed X-Men-like mutant superpowers, perhaps teleportation, time-bending, or self-cloning. Or maybe his thought was so heavy that it distorted the space around him, like a black hole, lending him the illusion of omnipresence. The traveler held nightly gatherings in his threadbare apartment and was befriended and indeed revered with a touch of condescension by the great British romantics. De Quincey compares Stewart to Shelley, who no doubt, like everyone else, was acquainted with Stewart. I think De Quincey is ragging Shelley here. Like the late Mr. Shelley, he had a vague enthusiasm and lofty aspirations in connection with human nature generally and its hopes. And like him, he strove to give steadiness, a uniform direction, and an intelligible purpose to those feelings by fitting them into a scheme of philosophical opinions. But unfortunately, the philosophical system of both was so far from supporting their own views and the cravings of their own enthusiasm that, as in some points it was baseless, incoherent, or unintelligible, so in others it tended to moral results from which, if they had foreseen them, they would have been themselves the first to shrink as contradictory to the very purposes in which their system had originated. I mean, I think maybe De Quincey thinks this kind of romanticism is corrupting. Thomas De Quincey thinks that? I mean, Thomas De Quincey is ragging morally on Percy Shelley? Look it up. These lives. Anyway, De Quincey places Stewart on one occasion, the English opium eater, De Quincey places Stewart on one occasion at a small party with William Godwin, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Southey, and Charles Lamb. What could be more romantic in the pre-1800 and also the post-1800 sense than walking solo over the face of the world, gaining acquaintance with who knows what cultures and ideas and costumes and cuisines and stories? Indeed, as my friend Glenn Mazes likes to point it out to me with the simplicity of a good insight, all these people were great walkers. Later on, so were Emerson and Thoreau. And all the romantics were younger than Stewart. Even Godwin was 7 years his junior, and he had 21 years on Wordsworth. The myth of walking Stewart must have been with these chappies from childhood, teaching them the exotic like a series of paintings by Delacroix. One should think of Stewart as a figure both of fun and veneration among the early British romantics. Not only for his constant appeals to nature, Stewart typically represents himself as the amusiast Omoousiast, the Omusiast, nature's only child, but also in the very idea of someone who experiences all the world's cultures. Now, on the other hand, most of these figures, in part because of the influence of thinkers such as Kant and Schiller, were philosophical idealists of one sort or another. Most of the people gathered in that room of all the eminent romantics. And I hope that Stewart at his dinners brought out many a material stick to beat them with. If you ask me, of course, the idealism of the romantics was rather unfortunate, or perhaps the word I am groping for is preposterous. Both the British and American romantics read way too much German philosophy. Along with the opium, quite the downfall of Coleridge, I think. What Stewart's position shows is that it's possible to be a materialist, or more widely, to celebrate and immerse oneself in the real world and still be plenty romantic. Surely Wordsworth in particular might have had some sympathy with this stance, to say nothing of Thoreau. The Romantics celebrated art and attacked reason, but Stewart's strategy was to expand the sense of reason from its Enlightenment scientistic sense. He described his preferred mode of reasoning as analogy, but by that he meant the very widest drawing of associations and the freest rushing to conclusions. He meant intellectual improvisational art. And here I would connect this to Edgar Allan Poe's essay Eureka, where he starts with a methodological excursus saying poetry is how you reach truth, even scientific truth, or at least one element. For that reason, among others, it's an awfully interesting brew, the man's philosophy. He's a materialist, but a skeptic about, or even an enemy of, experimental science, which he regards as arid and completely incapable of dealing with the richness and ambiguity of the real world. The fact that he had cultivated a serious hatred of the French and associated experimentalism with the French encyclopedists could not have helped. But his basic idea was to keep walking, just to keep walking. There's no telling in advance where your thinking feet might take you. Let yourself go and see. Stewart wrote many books in which he repeated his materialist philosophy incessantly in language that seemed ambivalent about being understood. Indeed, like many no doubt greater philosophers of that era and the 2 centuries that follow, Stewart's work bristles with coined technical terms and extremely complex sentences, embedding myriad clauses, the syntax of which does not invariably work out. At his best, he writes like Hegel or Schelling at their worst in translation. And reading his texts, or even just examining his books, does raise the issue of barminess. His books have titles like this. This is the title of one book. The Sophiometer, or Regulator of Mental Power, forming the nucleus of the moral world to convert talent, abilities, literature, and science into thought, sense, wisdom, and prudence, the God of man, to form these intermodifications. He restarted history with the publication of his book, The Apocalypse of Nature, dating his other works accordingly, like year 5. His books feature many prefaces, introductions, forewords, and so on, so that they never seem to actually begin. Or to end, sometimes they finish 5 times over in 100 pages with a definitive, all caps, the end. And then there's more. He certainly took himself seriously as a major figure, beginning his opus maximum. How about that for a title? Opus maximum, as follows. I shall open this stupendous essay of nature, of the intellectual energy, with the most important discovery of the moral laws of nature that was ever made by human intelligence, viz., that the word knowledge signifies no more than a capacity of the mind to conform the relations of thought to the phenomena or appearance of things, whereby we conceive the course or order of nature's action independent of its essence or unknown causes. Certainly, writes De Quincey, when I consider everything, he must have been crazy when the wind was north-northeast. No one read Stewart's books at the time, with the possible exception of De Quincey, who, like me, skimmed. They have never been reprinted, and they sank into complete obscurity, despite the fact that Stewart asked everyone he knew to bury copies of his work, so that after a disaster, perhaps a Jacobin revolution, the world could again be redeemed by his astounding insights. The dawn is just about to break. That's right. Thanks to walking Stewart. Now you see the light. But as unlikely as it seems, it's an extraordinary philosophy. That's why it's in this book, because it agrees with the philosophy of this book in a lot of ways. In many things, this is De Quincey, in many things he shocked the religious sense, especially as it exists in unphilosophic minds. And indeed, there can be no stronger proof of the utter obscurity in which his works have slumbered than that they should all have escaped prosecution. Right? De Quincey's a great wit. Stewart is a realist about the world and our experience of it. He's a materialist in a Lucretian mode, as well as a kind of pantheist or worshiper of the whole in a way that bespeaks the influence of Spinoza and of various Eastern religions or traditions. But he's also fundamentally an outsider in philosophy, as well as in whatever society he inhabited, including London's. This has its advantages and its disadvantages, and Stewart, by hook or crook, latched onto many a critical or constructive insight. His philosophy as a whole is remarkably similar to the one I'm trying to articulate, though I would stop short of Stewart's many expressions of Pan-psychism. So he's definitely a Pan-psychist. If you're interested in Pan-psychism, find interesting formulations in Stewart, actually, for real. At any rate, he's a realist in my sense, or in the sense of the term developed by speculative realists such as Graham Harman and Paul Levy-Bryant. Here's a quote from Stewart. "It burst upon my intelligence with a blaze of light the following momentous and natural notion, that all facts, relations, or analogies of things were totally independent of human opinion and its forms of logic or language. Fire, light, matter, motion, mind exist now with all their qualities as they existed at all times of antiquity, and no errors of language or opinion can give any alteration to their different qualities or degrees of relations or analogies in real existence." A flat declaration of metaphysical realism. It burst upon my intelligence with the blaze of light that all facts, relations, and analogies of things were totally independent of human opinion. Now imagine putting that forward in frigging 1800, okay? The moment, like it's the opposite of Kant, the opposite of Fichte, the opposite of Hegel and Schelling, who are coming along right then as grad students or something, right? It's the opposite of Coleridge. That is, we do not articulate or construct a world linguistically, he argues. We grapple with it linguistically, or defer or deflect or falsify it, or commit ourselves to it, and so on. But Stewart is explicit that human language and consciousness are themselves material things and relations. This is so radical in 1800, so true, and so unreadable, sadly. Although, I want to do a book, so if you're an editor, if you want a little book with an introduction and a collection of little writings of Walking Stewart, give me a call. crispinsorrell@gmail.com. No power, he writes, can exist without matter to support it or to give it a substratum. The action or power of any substance is nothing but matter modified into their action and power. The action of thought or consciousness in a human body is nothing but matter modified through its organism into the action of thought. And it is not the action that feels or thinks, but the body or matter itself that perceives its own action. Thought does not perceive matter, but it is matter that perceives thought. Thought does not perceive matter, but it is matter that perceives thought. And personal identity or modality is but a succession of thoughts produced by transmuting matter and has itself no possible being or identity which belongs entirely to matter. Personal identity is a matter of material continuity. These are radical positions, dude. Although he's Lucretius is his hero and Spinoza. All right. These are remarkable formulations of materialism with regard to mind, and I would say fundamentally innovative in the history of Western philosophy, or would have been if they had been read. He locates human identity and consciousness fully in the material body in connection to other material bodies. Stewart's materialism is not exactly atomism, though, as that's usually defined despite his admiration for Lucretius. He held with most atomists that matter was indestructible, but also against most that it was infinitely divisible, so that you can never get down to the fundamental speck, according to him. Stewart's matter is, we might say, essentially liquid rather than particulate. It flows. I like this picture, and it's connected with my notion that it is situations all the way down, or that individuals are individuated by their relations, or that matter is infinitely divisible. The atomists gave us, as it were, a digital reality, or a reality assembled out of direct points, out of distinct points. I'm having trouble reading now. Like a comic book or a television image, or like a pointillist painting. Epicurus says, one must not believe that there can be an unlimited number of masses, no matter how small, in any finite body. Consequently, not only must one eliminate unlimited division into smaller pieces to avoid making everything weak and being forced in our comprehensive grasp of compound things, to exhaust the things which exist by reducing them to non-existence, but one must also not believe that within finite bodies there is an unlimited movement, not even by smaller and smaller stages. That's surely the atomist attempt to deal with the Eleatic a priori arguments. Epicurus accepts the Parmenidean adage that something cannot come from nothing, nor nothing from something. And the answer to Zeno's paradoxes appears to be simply that space is not infinitely divisible. But Stewart, while he does not necessarily reject the notion of the void, makes matter continuous, or more like a wad of goo than like a pile of sand. The issue might be empirical in some sense, and in order to pay off on a notion like that, we might have to clear the ground of many problems. But so fungible and mobile is Stewart's matter, and ours, that the problem is to explain persistence and identity. But he also held that persistence and identity have been fundamentally exaggerated in the history of thought, and that in a world so liquid, which is flowing through us as we ourselves flow, only the good of the whole really bears scrutiny as an ontologically supportable ethical purpose. That, for Stewart, follows from our non-distinctness from all that is. We spent centuries imaginatively isolating ourselves, or eternalizing ourselves, or disembodying ourselves within the relentless and gorgeous and infinitely varied, ubiquitous everything. Now the point is to reconnect or experience the oneness of ourselves with the whole material system. A secular or materialist or naturalist redemption or nirvana. What he taught, he said, was a single principle, the identification of the self with nature. Quote, such an analysis into the nature of being, thing, essence, matter, or nature, which words are all synonymous, being, thing, essence, matter, or nature, teaches man the most important principles of self-knowledge. That is, that as immortal and indestructible matter is incessantly changing from the single agency of man into the patiency of all sensitive life. It is the interest of matter to augment the good of all sensitive life. And as the personal modality has no sameness of entity, being nothing, the personal modality has no sameness of entity. Being nothing but the action of that quantity of matter that supports it, like the eddy in the current. That's what we are, like an eddy in the current, not a distinct thing, but a swirl in the whole liquid. Um, all right. Which is nothing but a succession of action produced by the substance of matter of water, changing from agitation of one wave into the waves of the whole pool. Just so, matter transmutes from the agency of half a pound of brain in the mode of man into the patency of the brain of the whole sensitive system, and the personal modality of I, he, or you in the incessant change of life or annihilation by death can have no possible relation to matter itself. To augment or diminish the patency of its good or evil agency and its interest and identity with universal being. Matter or nature belongs wholly to matter. For personal modality, the personal has no real but only relative entity. A person has no real but only relative entity when considered as distinct from matter, which alone has eternal identity or positive existence. These are remarkable and original formulations, dude. Personal identity is a mere eddy. Personal identity is a mere eddy in the riverine material world, an illusion of separateness. The key to ethics would then be to overcome this illusion and to feel our material being in the material world from which we are not distinct or from which we flow. The contrast between liquid, wave, and particulate materialism, between liquid and particulate materialism, or between wave and particle maybe, in its way is of course a contrast about everything. The two pictures yield and reflect different senses of the relation of self and world. In that way, they reflect the personality or yearnings of the philosophers who develop or endorse them. They are also in their way political. Whether this world is liquid or particulate. They could correspond to different senses of the relation of individual to collectivity. Perhaps a gritty materialism reflects a sense of the polity as consisting without remainder of its individual citizens under their auspices, whereas a smooth materialism, a liquid materialism, might take the group as the fundamental reality within which individuals are constituted. Or perhaps a smooth political materialism could even deny that individual human beings are fully real. The fundamental organism is the group. But then it would place the whole group into the material flow of nature. These ethical or political or psychological corollaries are not entailments of the metaphysical views. Rather, they might precede and motivate the metaphysical theories. Nor is that an illegitimate procedure. In kind, it's the only procedure there is. Your metaphysics is going to be an attempt to express your experience and your longings. Of course, these can be roads to the truth. Now, really, the problem with Stewart's liquid materialism is precisely that it does not pay sufficient respect to individuals. He's always on the edge of saying that individuals are an illusion, which would be an immense betrayal of, for one thing, his own mobile, yet also solitary existence. He calls himself the solitary traveler. No one accompanied him on most of his journeys. One way to conceive the problem is precisely in terms of void, for which there appears to be no place in Stewart's materialist plenum. What's missing are the gaps and the discontinuities that make it possible to pick out distinct objects or make it possible to be a distinct thing. Through what does walking Stewart move? For the atomists, the question was how individuals could come into contact at all, how they could have any effect on each other when they were separated and hence defined by void. It's like you have infinitely many Parmenidean spheres bouncing around. Leibniz's monads, though they are anything but merely material, face the same or a worse problem of yearning to come into contact with other monads, but they are by definition alone. If the project is to try to systematize or encompass the world in a way true to our experiences of it and hence potentially true to it, we need to come down somewhere that gets you both and all and each, both individuals and their connections, objects and the ways they are not fully distinct. Every ontological system wrestles with this, even that of Parmenides, which concludes that individuals are an illusion, acknowledges, even that of Parmenides, which concludes that individuals are an illusion, acknowledges that there's something to be explained. That's why Epicurus has atoms vibrating, or why they exert various forces on one another in modern physics. We're trying both to have distinct things and to bring them together. And that's why Stewart is always acknowledging, for example, the individual consciousnesses, even as he's always undercutting them as ephemeral bubbles in the stream of time. Well, I suppose my metaphor is string in Entanglements. Notice that there's room for empty space in a skein. The string at a macro level is neither liquid nor particulate. Now, it's true that I, myself, melt individuals into relations. But it's also true that I build up massively incomparable individuals out of the totality of their relations. I regard individuals as occupying distinct sections of space and having massively distinct histories, but no individual is not constituted out of the skein or ever loses its connection entirely. By direct tie or unimaginably complex maze, every individual is connected to every other individual and is defined as an individual within a system of differences. To say of all this that it's vague and essentially unargued is to say the obvious. Now, as infelicitous as Stewart's prose undoubtedly is, it expresses, at once with passionate intensity and extreme abstraction, the experience of a man who was himself a flow, and who felt himself both disintegrating and being reconstituted in every encounter with another society, geography, and situation. That's what he wanted. Indeed, his own suicide by laudanum overdose in 1822 was conceived ahead of time as an illustration of this flow. This is Stewart. The intense action of thought and sense carried to its climax will make a man sympathize with brute matter, which by his food and the absorption of his pores he is constantly transforming into consciousness or sensate life. That's what we do. We eat and stuff and we transform matter into consciousness. And the morbid patient may conceive it both his interest and his duty to abstain from a redundancy of food and save even half a pound of matter from the anguish of disease. And should his body arrive at a state of incurable chronic anguish, thought and sense would generate that high degree of fortitude to amputate his mode from the system of sensitive life, as he would amputate a gangrened or mortified arm from the system of his body, to augment the good and diminish the evil of identified self and nature. Stewart's materialism, in other words, gave him comfort in the face of death and caused him to affirm even his own death. As Socrates thought that the idealist philosopher studies to die, Stewart thought the same of the materialist, and comfort in the face of suffering, loss, and death has, reputation to the contrary, been the business of materialists since Epicurus. Consolation in the face of death has been one of the projects of materialism since Epicurus. What connects materialism to science, or makes it modern, even in its ancient forms, is that it forgoes Aristotelian final causes and a teleological conception of history and the universe. It specifically denies that the universe has an agent, a perpetrator, a design. It's perhaps just one thing after another. Democritus even taught that there were myriad cosmoi, perhaps as many as there are possible configurations of atoms in a vast but finite space. The fact that this one is as it is, for example, this universe is as it is, for example, that it is such as can give rise to and support creatures such as ourselves, is not the product of a design, but of a crapshoot. The specific appeal of this insight is that it refuses everything that is not in the order of nature, that it repudiates the supernatural, whether platonic forms, gods, miracles, disembodied souls, or minds. It keeps on trying to pull everything onto a single plane. A ham-handed Philistine simplification, or else a beautiful joining of all things in a web of connection and mutual dependence. A reconciliation already necessary in the time of Plato between people in the world. In principle, Walking Stewart knew he could have found a way to penetrate into China. All things are connected. And that's what maybe he conceived what he was doing as connecting all things by literally traversing the world. what a cool philosopher who happens to, agree with me basically in his metaphysics in this really rich and interesting way. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. Like I say, I'm just kind of lecturing here and there, pulling out some greatest hits from previous writings and stuff, because I'm no longer teaching and I have this impulse to.